Picture this. You're living in Norway in the year 832 after Christ. There's no central heating, no grocery stores, no emergency services. When winter comes, and we're talking about a winter that would make a modern blizzard look like a light dusting, you either had enough food stored up or you died. It really was that simple. Now, imagine you're 17-year-old Bjorn Ironfoot, and you're kneeling beside your father's frozen corpse in your family's longhouse near Sognefjord. The man who taught you everything about survival, who showed you which trees made the best trap triggers, who passed down generations of hunting wisdom. He's gone. And outside? Snow is falling so thick it could literally bury a standing man. We're not talking about the kind of snow that cancels school. We're talking about snow that erases the landscape, that turns familiar hunting grounds into an alien wasteland of white death. 3 days ago, Bjorn's family ate their last piece of dried fish. Think about that for a moment. In our world, running out of food means a trip to the store, maybe ordering takeout. In Bjorn's world, it meant staring at death. And here's the terrifying part. 40% of his village had already succumbed to winter's grip. 40%. Nearly half the people he'd grown up with. People who'd survived previous winters, who knew the old ways, who'd done everything right according to centuries of tradition. Dead. The skeletal remains that archaeologists would discover more than 1,000 years later tell a story that would make your blood run cold. These weren't people who died quickly. They died slowly, systematically, as their bodies consumed themselves. Muscle first, then organs, as winter stretched on, and the traditional methods that had sustained their ancestors simply stopped working. And this is where our story gets really interesting, because something was changing in the climate. The medieval warm period, that relatively balmy stretch that would make Viking expansion possible, hadn't begun yet. Instead, the Norse were caught in a climate shift that made winters longer, deeper, more unpredictable. The spruce trigger traps that Bjorn's grandfather had taught his father, and his father had taught him, these weren't just failing occasionally. They were becoming useless. Now, put yourself in Bjorn's position. Everything you've been taught about survival is proving inadequate. The trap locations that had fed families for generations are buried under 7 feet of snow. The game trails that animals had used for centuries are gone, erased by weather patterns that seem to follow no familiar rules. Your neighbors are dying. Your father is dead. Your mother, Astrid Silvertongue, and what a name that is singing the death songs, the ancient melodies that were supposed to guide souls to the afterlife. What do? Most people would follow tradition. Most people would accept that this was simply their fate, that the gods had decided their time was up. But Bjorn Ironfoot wasn't most people. As he knelt there beside his father's body, listening to his mother's haunting laments, something crystallized in that young man's mind. He made a vow that would echo through centuries. He would not just survive winter, he would conquer it. Now, there was an old woman in the village, ancient Thorun Snowreader. The villagers called her a Volva, a seer, a practitioner of magic that most rational Vikings considered women's foolishness. But that night, as Bjorn made his silent promise to his dead father, Thorun saw something in the boy's eyes, something that made her decide to share knowledge that others dismissed as superstition. She began teaching Bjorn that snow wasn't just frozen water. It was alive, she insisted. It breathed. It held memories. It could be read like runes carved by the gods themselves. To most of the village, this was the ramblings of a neat old woman who'd spent too many winters alone with her thoughts. But to Bjorn, desperate and grieving and angry at the inadequacy of everything he'd been taught, these strange ideas represented something precious: hope. The social dynamics of the village made Bjorn's situation even more desperate. 3 clans controlled the best hunting grounds along the fjord: the wolf spears, the ironwoods, and the blood axes. Their jarls, their leaders, hoarded the traditional trap locations like gold, passing the prime spots down through bloodlines like inherited wealth. Bjorn's family were carls, middle-ranking freemen, respectable but not powerful. They had access to decent hunting grounds, but not the best. And in a climate where even the best locations were failing, decent wasn't enough. So Bjorn faced a choice that defined not just his life, but the lives of countless generations that would follow. He could accept starvation, could bow to the social order that said his family's rank meant they deserved less, could follow the traditional methods that were clearly failing. Or he could innovate. He chose innovation. And that choice, made by a grieving teenager in a freezing longhouse while his father's body grew stiff beside him, would change the course of history. Bjorn began his systematic study of snow, wind, and the secret lives of winter animals. But here's what makes this story so compelling. His first 100 attempts failed spectacularly. We're not talking about minor setbacks. We're talking about complete, embarrassing, sometimes dangerous failures that marked him as either touched by genius or cursed by Loki, the trickster god. But each failure taught him something about pressure, about temperature, about the hidden architecture of snowdrifts, about how animals moved through winter landscapes that seemed utterly barren to human eyes, about how the old ways, the traditional ways that had sustained his people for generations, were based on assumptions that were no longer true. And as that terrible winter dragged on, as more neighbors died and the snow continued to fall, Bjorn was building toward a breakthrough that would revolutionize not just how the Norse survived winter, but how they understood their relationship with the natural world itself. What he discovered would challenge everything his people believed about hunting, about tradition, about the immutable laws of survival in the far north. It would make him wealthy, powerful, and ultimately legendary. But it would also set in motion changes that would help fuel the most aggressive period of Viking expansion in history. But that's a story for what comes next. Because right now, in that longhouse beside Sognefjord, Bjorn Ironfoot was just a grieving boy with a dangerous idea and the desperate courage to pursue it, no matter where it led. 3 winters passed in relentless experimentation. And when I say relentless, I mean the kind of obsessive dedication that would make a modern scientist look casual. Bjorn, now 17, had invested 3 years' worth of precious iron, 36 pounds of worked metal that could have bought 2 good cows. In a society where iron was literally worth its weight in survival, this was like a modern inventor mortgaging their house to fund a crazy idea. His workshop, and I use that term loosely because we're talking about a converted storage shed behind the longhouse, became a graveyard of failed prototypes. Picture walking into this space. Twisted metal contraptions that looked like torture devices. Wooden mechanisms warped by moisture and cold. Sinew bindings that had snapped under pressure they were never designed to handle. It was the laboratory of someone who was either on the verge of genius or complete madness. The village had a name for the spring of 835, the Spring of Severed Fingers. And yes, it was exactly as grisly as it sounds. Bjorn's spring-loaded designs, his attempts to create traps that could function beneath the snow, had maimed 3 kinsmen, including his own uncle. We're not talking about minor cuts here. We're talking about life-altering injuries in a time when losing fingers meant losing your ability to work, to fight, to survive. The village labeled him touched by Loki, the trickster god, and honestly, can you blame them? Here was this young man, barely out of boyhood, destroying valuable resources, injuring his relatives, and pursuing what seemed like an impossible dream while people around him continued to die each winter. In their eyes, Bjorn wasn't an innovator. He was a dangerous fool. But here's what separates true innovators from everyone else. They persist when rational people would quit. Bjorn filled birch bark scrolls with detailed drawings, documenting wind patterns, snow crystal formations, and animal behavior with the methodical precision of a modern researcher. He was creating the world's first systematic study of winter ecology, though he didn't have words for what he was doing. His breakthrough began during the Great White Death of 836, when snow fell for 17 straight days. 17 days. Try to imagine that. Modern weather services would declare a state of emergency after 3 days of heavy snow. But Bjorn was trapped in his workshop for over 2 weeks, with nothing but his thoughts, his failed experiments, and an increasingly desperate need to solve the puzzle that was killing his people. And that's when he noticed something extraordinary. His breath, his warm, moist breath in the freezing air of the workshop, was creating tiny tunnels in the snow that had blown through cracks in the walls. These weren't just temporary disturbances. These air channels persisted for hours, maintaining pathways that were invisible to the eye but clear to his nose. Now, this might seem like a small observation, but it was the kind of breakthrough that changes everything. Bjorn realized that animals navigated beneath snow using scent trails through natural air pockets. Think about this for a moment. While human hunters were placing traps based on where they could see, animals were traveling through an invisible three-dimensional highway system that existed entirely beneath the surface. Traditional traps failed because they created dead zones, solid barriers that disrupted these invisible highways. It was like putting a roadblock across an interstate and wondering why traffic stopped flowing. Bjorn spent months perfecting a revolutionary design, a trap that breathed. The engineering was deceptively simple, which is often the mark of true innovation. Using hollow reeds and carefully placed channels, his creation maintained scent corridors that drew prey directly to the kill zone. Curved wooden guides created air vortexes that prevented snow from fully packing, while strategic placement of aromatic bait, fermented fish oil mixed with blood, created irresistible scent plumes that could travel through snow like water through a sponge. But understanding the principle and making it work in the deadly reality of a Norwegian winter were two very different things. Testing nearly killed him. During a blizzard in 837, Bjorn stayed out for 3 days straight, observing how Arctic hares and foxes approached his prototypes. 3 days in a blizzard. In modern terms, this would be like camping in Antarctica during a storm, with primitive gear and no backup plan. The encounter that became legend happened at dawn on the 3rd day. A massive brown bear, driven mad by hunger, charged him. Now, understand that a hungry bear in winter is one of nature's most dangerous creatures. This wasn't a casual wildlife encounter. This was a 900-pound killing machine that saw Bjorn as its next meal. Half frozen and exhausted, Bjorn used his own trap design to injure the bear's paw, escaping while the beast fought to free itself. The irony wasn't lost on him. His innovation, designed to catch smaller game, had saved his life from the apex predator of the northern forests. He bore the claw scars across his back for life, 4 parallel furrows that served as permanent proof of his dedication to mastering winter's secrets. But those scars also represented something more profound. They marked the moment when Bjorn stopped being an experimenter and became something else entirely, a man who had literally fought nature and won, not through brute force, but through understanding its deepest principles. The breathing trap wasn't just a hunting device. It was a new way of thinking about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Instead of imposing human logic on winter, Bjorn had learned to think like winter itself. He had discovered that survival wasn't about conquering nature, it was about partnering with it. And that partnership was about to change everything. Because word of Bjorn's success was spreading through the fjords like wildfire, and the implications of what he'd achieved were about to transform not just how the Norse survived winter, but how they understood their place in the world itself. What happened next would prove that innovation, even the most beneficial innovation, always threatens someone's power. And in the Viking world, threatened power meant one thing: violence. Word of Bjorn's success spread like wildfire through the fjords, and when I say wildfire, I mean it moved with the unstoppable force of truly revolutionary technology. The winter of 841 became known as the Season of Full Bellies in Sognefjord, and that name tells you everything you need to know about how transformative this innovation was. His breathing traps caught enough game to feed 5 clans. 5 clans, where traditional methods might snare 1 rabbit per week, if you were lucky, if the weather cooperated, if the gods smiled upon you. Bjorn's innovations captured 3 to 5 animals daily. Reindeer, elk, foxes, and hares. All fell to the invisible hunters beneath the snow. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because innovation never exists in a vacuum. Success breeds envy, and envy breeds conflict. The rival jarls responded with typical Viking diplomacy. First bribes, then threats, finally violence. The Wolfspear clan sent 3 spies disguised as traders. Picture this scene. These hardened warriors, men who'd raided the coasts of England and Ireland, trying to play the part of innocent merchants while desperately attempting to figure out how a young Carl had revolutionized an art their families had practiced for centuries. It would have been almost comical if the stakes weren't life and death. But Bjorn had anticipated this. He'd grown up in a world where information was power, where survival often depended on keeping secrets. So he allowed these traders to observe him constructing fake traps with deliberately flawed designs, sending them home with useless information. Imagine their master's frustration when their stolen secrets produced nothing but broken wood and wasted iron. When intimidation failed, and trust me, Viking intimidation was no joke, Jarl Grim Bloodaxe attempted outright theft. The name tells you everything about this man's approach to problem-solving. He raided Bjorn's workshop with a dozen armed men, expecting to find the secret to winter survival just lying around waiting to be stolen. They found only standard equipment. Bjorn kept his real work hidden in natural ice caves known only to his family, locations that had been sacred to his lineage for generations. This wasn't just practical security, it was a demonstration of how deeply Bjorn understood that true innovation couldn't be stolen, only learned. The technology's spread followed fascinating patterns that tell us as much about medieval society as they do about the innovation itself. Rather than selling his secret, and he could have become wealthy beyond imagination by doing so, Bjorn created an apprentice system. Young hunters spent 3 seasons learning not just construction techniques, but the spiritual relationship with winter itself. Think about that for a moment. Bjorn understood something that many modern innovators miss. The most powerful technologies aren't just tools, they're new ways of seeing the world. You couldn't just copy the breathing trap. You had to understand winter differently, had to develop what we might call a new ecological consciousness. Women played crucial roles in this transformation, which shouldn't surprise us given their central importance in Norse society. They wove the specific patterns of sinew needed for the breathing channels, and developed new preservation techniques for the dramatically increased meat supply. Marriage negotiations soon included trap-making knowledge as dowry. Bjorn's union with Sigrid Jarlsdottir, daughter of a reformed enemy, created the first inter-clan trap alliance. Cultural transformation followed technological innovation, as it always does. New festivals emerged around First Trap Day, when communities gathered to bless the devices with mead and blood. Children played games mimicking the breathing patterns, unconsciously learning the principles that would serve them as adult hunters. Skalds composed songs about Bjorn, who taught iron to breathe, embedding the innovation in the cultural memory of the people. The economic effects rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Surplus winter protein enabled larger families. When you're not worried about starvation, you can afford to have more children. Healthier warriors meant more successful raids, longer raiding seasons, greater accumulation of wealth and power. Villages adopting the breathing trap saw winter mortality drop from 40% to 15% within a single generation. 15%, still horrifying by modern standards, but representing the difference between slow extinction and sustainable growth for these communities. The breathing trap had literally saved Norse civilization in some regions, allowing populations to not just survive but thrive in conditions that had previously meant certain death. But here's where our story takes on darker implications, because technological revolution always has unintended consequences. Easier winter survival meant larger populations, and larger populations required territorial expansion. The breathing trap became an invisible engine of the Viking Age's most aggressive period. Well-fed warriors raided further, settled broader, conquered more. The innovation that had begun as a desperate attempt to survive a brutal winter had become a tool of empire. Bjorn lived to see Norwegian settlements spread from Ireland to Russia, his simple invention helping fuel an expansion that would reshape the medieval world. When people asked him about this later in his life, about whether he felt responsible for the violence his innovation had enabled, Bjorn expressed no regret. Survival trumped all other concerns in the harsh north. He had solved the problem in front of him, winter starvation, and the rest was up to history. This brings us to one of the most profound questions about innovation. Are inventors responsible for how their creations are used? Bjorn had created a tool for survival, but that tool had enabled conquest. He had saved his people, but in doing so, he had given them the strength to threaten others. The breathing trap was spreading beyond Scandinavia now, carried by traders and raiders to the edges of the known world. And with each new adoption, each new community that learned to breathe with winter instead of fighting against it, the balance of power in the medieval world shifted just a little bit more. But Bjorn himself was aging, and the man who had revolutionized hunting was about to face the one trap no innovation could help him escape: the simple, inexorable passage of time. By 850, breathing traps had revolutionized Norse expansion in ways that Bjorn could never have imagined when he first knelt beside his father's frozen corpse. His sons, Eirik Quickbreath and Magnus Trapweaver, and notice how their very names reflected their father's innovation, carried the knowledge to Iceland's volcanic shores and Greenland's icy coasts. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. The breathing trap didn't just spread through Norse communities. It adapted, evolved, merged with local knowledge in ways that created entirely new hunting traditions. Indigenous peoples in Vinland, what later ages would call Newfoundland, adapted the design using whalebone instead of wood, creating hybrid technologies that survived into modern times. The Thule people, masters of Arctic survival, incorporated breathing principles into seal hunting. Picture this. Techniques developed for catching rabbits in Norwegian snow being transformed to harvest seals through ice holes in the high Arctic. The Mi'kmaq hunters modified the concept for forest use, creating woodland versions that could catch everything from squirrels to deer. This cross-cultural pollination of hunting technology represents something profound about human innovation. Good ideas don't respect borders, languages, or cultural boundaries. They spread, adapt, and evolve, taking on new forms as they encounter new environments and new minds. The invention's dark irony emerged slowly, like a truth too uncomfortable to face directly. The breathing trap had made winter survival easier, which meant larger populations, which meant pressure for territorial expansion. Bjorn's innovation became an invisible engine driving the Viking Age's most aggressive period. Think about the chain of causation here. A young man's desperate attempt to save his family from starvation ultimately helped fuel centuries of conquest and exploration. The same technology that allowed Norse communities to thrive in harsh winters also gave them the population base and economic surplus necessary to launch the raids and settlements that would terrorize and transform medieval Europe. Well-fed warriors could raid further and more frequently. Stable winter populations could support longer expeditions. The economic surplus from successful hunting could fund ships, weapons, and the complex logistics of long-distance warfare. Bjorn's breathing trap had become, in effect, a military technology, though he'd never intended it as such. Bjorn lived to see Norwegian settlements spread from Ireland to Russia, his simple innovation helping fuel an empire that spanned half the known world. When he walked through the markets of Trondheim in his later years, he could see goods from a dozen different lands, wealth flowing back from conquests enabled partly by the population stability his traps had provided. Did he feel responsible? The sagas suggest he felt pride, not guilt. He had solved the problem in front of him, winter starvation, and had never claimed to control how others used his solution. In his worldview, survival was the highest virtue, and everything else was secondary to that fundamental imperative. Bjorn's death in 873 carried profound symbolism that wasn't lost on his contemporaries. At 61, ancient by Viking standards, he insisted on one final bear hunt. The great brown bears had become his lifelong adversaries and teachers, the creatures that had first tested his innovation and nearly killed him in the process. When a massive male charged his grandson Eric, Bjorn intercepted, taking mortal wounds while demonstrating the trap's ultimate evolution, a handheld version that could be deployed instantly. Picture this scene. An old man, his body bearing the scars of a lifetime spent wrestling with winter's Dixix challenges, using his final moments to protect the next generation while showcasing the evolution of his life's work. As he lay dying, he passed not just technical knowledge but spiritual understanding to his family gathered around him. The secret isn't in the iron or wood. he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. It's in knowing that winter itself breathes. We must breathe with it, not against it. Those words encapsulate something profound about innovation and humanity's relationship with nature. Bjorn hadn't conquered winter through brute force or superior firepower. He'd succeeded by learning to understand winter's own logic, by discovering how to work with natural systems rather than against them. Archaeological evidence found in 1997 near Trondheim confirmed what the sagas had preserved in story form. Preserved trap components showed sophisticated engineering that even modern analysis found impressive. Micro-channels that would indeed maintain airflow in packed snow, pressure release mechanisms that could function in sub-zero temperatures, design principles that anticipated animal behavior with remarkable accuracy. But Bjorn's legacy lived not just in technology but in mindset. The transformation of winter from enemy to partner, of innovation from divine gift to human achievement. He had demonstrated that ordinary people could solve extraordinary problems through observation, experimentation, and sheer stubborn persistence. Norwegian folklore still speaks of Bjorn's breath, the warm winds that sometimes melt snow in perfect circles, revealing the earth beneath as if winter itself remembers the man who first learned its secrets. These thermal events, perfectly explainable by modern meteorology, carry deeper meaning for people who understand that innovation changes not just how we live, but how we see the world around us. The breathing trap represents something timeless about human ingenuity, our capacity to observe, carefully, think creatively, and persist through failure until we find solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Bjorn Ironfoot wasn't a mythical hero or a divinely inspired genius. He was a desperate young man who refused to accept that winter had to mean death, who believed that understanding could triumph over tradition, who was willing to risk everything for the possibility of something better. In our modern world, facing our own seemingly impossible challenges, climate change, resource depletion, social inequality, Bjorn's story reminds us that innovation often comes not from those with the most resources or the highest status, but from those who are desperate enough to question everything and persistent enough to keep trying when rational people would quit. The boy who knelt beside his father's frozen corpse in 832 had become the man who taught an entire civilization to breathe with winter instead of fighting against it. And in doing so, he had changed not just how people survived, but how they understood their place in the natural world itself. That transformation, from helpless victim of circumstance to thoughtful partner with nature, remains the most profound legacy of all.